the questions dealing with the first part of chapter 17 that we studied last week. On lesson 6 in the workbook, question number 8 says, describe Goliath in these following areas. What was his height? 9 foot 9 inches, or 6 cubits in a span. Says weight of his armor. 5,000 shekels of bronze, about 125 pounds. Weight of his spearhead. 600 shekels of iron, 15 pounds. His armor, what armor is described there, I guess, would be on his armor. Coat of mail or scale armor, and he had greaves on his legs, on his calf, shin bones. Says, what taunt did Goliath speak against God? Okay. It mentions that he defied the ranks of Israel. That could be there in verse 10. Says, what was David's role at the outset of the war? What was he doing? He was taking care of his father's sheep, and he also was sent to bring supplies and to see about his brothers. Why did David go to the battlefield? Well, I just mentioned that. Sent by Jesse. He had grain and loaves for his brothers and cheese for the commander, and he was looking to their welfare. Question 12 says, why did his brothers think he had come? What does his brother accuse him of anyway? Just to see the battle. That's all he's there for. Why was David so upset about hearing Goliath's taunt? He was a reproach to Israel and the armies of the living God. He took it as a blasphemy to speak the way he was speaking. Why did David think he could be successful in fighting Goliath? He had God on his side, and what about his past experience? He defeated a lion, he defeated a bear already. So if God can deliver him from those, then he can deliver him from this Philistine. Why did David reject Saul's weapons? Too big, he hadn't tested them, it says. Says, what gave David the victory over Goliath? What does he say? He comes. The name of the Lord, or the Lord, gave him victory. Here's his response to Goliath saying that he would chop off his head and feed him to the birds. Then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword and a spear and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have taunted. This day the Lord will deliver you up into my hands, and I will strike you down and remove your head from you. And I will give the dead bodies of the army of the Philistines this day to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord does not deliver by sword or by spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. So he believes fully in God's providence and protection, and that he is able to deliver with just a few, or someone who's weak. Doesn't need big weapons and big numbers in order to deliver his people. That God is able to deliver on his own. And he's done it many, many times throughout the Bible and throughout history, that he's delivered God's people from being annihilated, or the Bible from being destroyed, or the church from being destroyed. And many efforts to try to destroy God's cause, and it always fails. So we should have great confidence if we put the Lord first and stay on his side, that He will be with us to protect our souls and to make sure that we certainly we can be confident about whose hands we're in as far as our souls concerned. So David gave that report that he's going to show to everybody, he's going to see that day that God is in Israel. So then in verses 48 through 51, you have what took place in the battle itself. Thus, it happened that when the Philistine rose and came and drew near to David, that David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand into his bag and took from it a stone and slung it, and struck the Philistine on his forehead, and the stone sank into his forehead, so that he fell on his face to the ground. Thus David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and he struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in David's hand. So, as you look at the text there, Goliath comes forward to put an end to this, and David doesn't back down at all. He runs toward Goliath. He removes that stone, one of those 5 smooth stones he put in his bag, and places it in his sling, and he slung it or hurled it forth and struck him on the forehead or on the brow of his face. The stone sank into his head. It means to sink down, to pierce. It's a word translated drowned in the Old Testament. It sunk into his head, and he fell to the ground like a big tree, I suppose. The bigger they are, the harder they fall. He went straight down to the ground, and David prevailed. He grew strong, but showed himself victorious and powerful over this Philistine by the help of God. And he did so, it says, with a sling and a stone, and he did not have a sword in his hand. So he cuts off his head, we're told, with his own sword. In verse 51, then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. And when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. And the men of Israel and Judah arose and shouted and pursued the Philistine as far as the valley and to the gates of Ekron. And the slain Philistines lay along the way to Shearam, even to Gath and Ekron. And the sons of Israel returned from chasing the Philistines and plundered their camp. And then David took the Philistine's head and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his weapons in his tent. So you have, the security of this giant that they're all standing up for to be their great defender is struck down by God by the use of this single man in combat. And as a result, the Philistines are shocked. They weren't expecting any such an outcome that day. Anybody could stand against Goliath, so they fled or escaped, took flight to try to escape from the battlefield. And they go in 2 different directions. The battle was fought in the valley of Elah. Some of them go to Ekron, and there's a road, I guess, that divides there, and the other part goes to Gath. And it says that the slain Philistines, I think in the King James it says wounded, but the word really means pierced or fatally wounded is what the Hebrew dictionaries were looking that word up. So they weren't just wounded, but they were fatally wounded. A lot of their dead bodies were laying along the road. Shearam is a town in Judah. It has double gates, is the meaning of the word. These words that end in "im" are a plural, so it has 2 gates. Most all cities, even large cities, many times only had 1 gate. This city, it says, had 2 gates and had that name. And it is a fortress there on the border between the 2 kingdoms. And Israel returns from the battle and plunders the camp. We're told by archaeologists they've dug up that city. Here is the valley of Elah Valley. See here where David went across and picked up the stones. And you had the camp of the Philistines on one side and Israel on the other, and that valley in between. Shearam is right here, is where they found that city. And the pictures over here show one gate going this way, and then there's another gate facing the other direction. So just like the Bible says, there's the city right on the place where the Philistines fled. Their dead bodies were laying all along the road as they went past that city. And when the Bible says something, an archaeologist goes and starts digging around, they find it every time. Just out they look for it, even though that city was abandoned in 925 BC. So it's been buried all that time. And they dig it up, and there's two gates, like the Bible says. So it had to be somebody that alive back there at that time to know about those gates, right? I mean, it's been buried in the dirt ever since then. It couldn't be written way later. How would you know it had two gates? So some person had accurate information about that city, where that battle was fought, and who fell there. Some of these things just recently have been discovered. So all the time there's things coming up to confirm the word of God. So David brings the Philistines' head to Jerusalem, it said in verse 54. So there are many pictures that you can find that artists have drawn of this giant head that he carried back with him as a trophy from the battlefield and took it to the city of Jerusalem. You know, later the city's going to be captured. The citadel was held by the Jebusites ever since the days of Joshua. But David and his men are going to go up and conquer that when he becomes king. And he makes Jerusalem his capital. So he takes the trophy to the part of the city that belongs to the Israelites, I guess. Some think when he hung it up on the wall or whatever it might be. It was certainly, if you were a Jebusite, it would be sort of a symbol of better not mess with this guy when he comes to power. He puts the weapons in his tent. So evidently these spoils that he took off of the body of the Philistine were kept by David. We know especially the sword. Will be mentioned later. He stores it at the tabernacle. And the priest, he asks for it, when he gets the showbread to eat. And they give him that sword because he says there's no other sword like it when he flees from Saul. So that sword comes up again later. Then there's a conversation that is held in verse 55 through 58, between Saul and Abner, his uncle. It says, "Now when Saul saw David going out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, this young man said, 'By your life, O king, I do not know.' And the king said, 'You inquire whose son this youth is.' So when David returned from killing the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul, with the Philistine's head in his hand. So Saul said to him, 'Whose son are you, young man?' And David answered, 'I am the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite.'" So this is where that question comes up, and it's in different books about difficult passages in the Bible or possible contradictions in the Bible because of what was mentioned in the chapter before, that David came and that he had been sent for from his father Jesse, and he came and played before Saul so that that evil spirit might be soothed that came upon him. And then in this chapter, it's like Saul doesn't know who he is. So that's the reason we say it could be like in many places in the Old Testament. They kind of give you a summary of what's going to happen, and then they tell you the details. And that this is not a contradiction, it's just giving you the details about how he first saw David, first found out about who his father was. And then maybe at that time is when they heard about him playing the harp, and he sends for him. So maybe all that stuff hasn't even happened yet. But there are other explanations that are given. One thing to bear in mind is that it says neither Saul nor Abner knew David's father. It really doesn't say in the text they didn't know David, does it? So I mean, still, David could have been playing the harp for him, and he just either forgot or he doesn't know who his father is. His father's house was to be free from taxes, what it said earlier, if he killed the giant. So who's his father? They can't remember, Jesse. So it might not even have to do with he didn't know David. The text actually said he didn't know his father. And some then argue if he didn't know David and he had played the lyre before him, that he wasn't that important for him to pay that much attention to, or that his appearance has changed. Maybe he's grown a beard, he's gotten a little older. People can really change in their appearance. I'm always shocked on Facebook of the young people out in California where I preach, and I see what they've grown into since we left. It's like some of them I wouldn't know if I ran into them, I don't think. Robert Jamieson in his commentary says the growth of the beard and other changes in the now full-grown youth prevented the king from recognizing his favorite minstrel. But really, I think the best explanation is that this chapter isn't in chronological order with what went before. It was a summary in chapter 16. So David is going to flee from Saul in chapters 18 through 21. A number of different times until he finally makes a complete break with Saul and he can't ever come back. And we're told about this rift that happens. Here, David is a great hero to the whole nation and to Saul, and he's going to be appointed a courtier, one that's over his mighty men, his guards, and he's one that plays the lyre or the harp for him to soothe him. And then he becomes a fugitive, and in chapters 19 through 22, first part of 22, then he's an outlaw. Many other people that are unattached come and join themselves to David out in the wilderness. And then finally, to get away from Saul, he becomes a mercenary for the Philistines. So there's sort of an outline of the rest of the book of 1 Samuel there. So we're told then about after this great battle is won, the close relationship that David had with Jonathan. Jonathan was a faithful and righteous man. Makes you wonder about Jonathan. Was he kind of, his faith and confidence slipped a little bit over the years as far as he didn't go out and fight Goliath. Before he was willing to go out. Maybe his father and all those in the court have had some negative influence on Jonathan that he's not as bold as he was before, but he sure admires David and sees in David the kind of faith and courage that he used to have and that he certainly wants to have. It says, now it came about that when he had finished speaking to Saul, that the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as himself. And Saul took him that day and did not let him return to his father's house. And then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. And Jonathan stripped himself of his robe that was on him and gave it to David with his armor, including his sword and his bow and his belt. So David went out wherever Saul sent him and prospered. And Saul set him over the men of war, and he was pleasing in the sight of all the people and also in the sight of Saul's servants. So that verse there almost sounds like a summary of what we're going to study later, where he set over the people and all of that. Later we'll hear about him getting appointed over 1,000 men. So it could be like he's giving you a little summary, and then he's going to fill in exactly how it all unfolds as we read through the chapter. So Jonathan was evidently at the battle, kind of infer that he's there with his father and saw these things transpire in the pursuit of the Philistines and the great slaughter and the gathering of all that spoil after the battle was over. And from that day, he loves David as his best friend. He's got very close bond with David. They have the same faith, the same courage, and their hearts are, his heart is knit, it's bound. They form a league together towards one another. And many of us in our life, we have best friends, people that we especially talk to and trust and share things with. And David and Jonathan had that kind of relationship. He's got a deep affection, admiration, devotion. There's loyalty between them. They're willing to die for one another. So they are true friends. They're going to look out for one another's family should anything happen to the other. So Saul's attached to David on a permanent basis. He no longer is going to go back and forth from Saul's court. That's what he was doing before. Now he's going to be there full time in the service of the king. And Jonathan and David, they make a covenant of friendship there. They're going to be helpful to one another and look out for one another's families. And he gives David as a sign his robe as the son of the king. I mean, that'd be a important robe or mantle that he gives him. Some people say it might be the armor. It's the outer garment is the word that's used there, not the tunic on the inside. And he gives him his sword and his bow and his belt. So a great honor, a gesture of friendship to David because of his valor. In verse 5, it talks about how David in the service of Saul acted wisely, and as a result, he prospered in all of the commissions that he was given, so that he ends up being placed over the men of war. Always makes me think, as you look at the word prosper there, in the Hebrew, it talks about to be prudent or circumspect, and then it means to have success. When whenever I teach people Isaiah chapter 53, well, it starts in 52 and about verse 12 of Isaiah, and it describes the Christ. It says that he is going to prosper, or he's going to act wisely. The same word is used there of Jesus Christ, that he is wise and successful in his service to God and to save us. And David is a type of that. He's a type of Christ. He is that same kind of obedient servant in the kingdom of God and in God's purpose that Jesus Christ is going to be. He was pleasing to the people. He was in their good pleasure, and he made good decisions to promote, to be promoted. And he's approved by all the civil and military officials there in verse 5. So David is going to be a very important person in the kingdom. He's sort of the hero of the day at this time. So then verses 6 through 9, we see where things begin to turn. It says, it happened as they were coming, when David returned from killing the Philistine. It doesn't take very long until there's a problem. Says that the women came out of all of the cities of Israel singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with joy, and with musical instruments. And the women sang as they played and said, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000. Then Saul became very angry, for this saying displeased him. And he said, they have ascribed to David 10,000s, but to me they have ascribed thousands. Now, what more can he have but the kingdom? So Saul looked at David with suspicion from that day on. Again, that first part sounds more like a summary of what's coming, because he's in Saul's favor and he's promoted. But here it's like right after the killing Goliath is where the story picks up. And right at the very beginning, the people begin to praise David too much for Saul. He doesn't like it. They were singing and dancing and playing as they went from city and village as they're on their way back to Gibeah, I guess. And in each city, they're singing in this alternate way to one another. You know, one group of women would say one line and the other women would say the other. They're kind of singing in parts back and forth. And some would say, Saul has killed his thousands and David his 10,000. Very unfortunate. I'm sure if they knew that this was going to cause Saul to be crazy with jealousy, they would have put the song together different, but they don't think there's any. I'm sure they didn't intend for that to happen, but Saul takes it in the worst way possible. That here's his rival that Samuel said, I'm going to anoint. There's going to be, your neighbor's going to be raised up to take your place who's better than you. And he's been looking for that man. Who is this man that's better than me? And now the people are saying David's better than you. So he is suspicious of David. And he looks on him with suspicion, or he eyes him enviously, the Hebrew dictionary says. He looks askance at him. It says, Saul from that day saw David as a threat. Even though David keeps getting exalted in his position, the whole time Saul is looking at him and watching him and thinking he's a threat. So he's kind of got it in from David right at the very beginning. It's such a sinful attitude of mind. It's God's will that David take his place. And it was even announced by the prophet Samuel that somebody's going to come along to be the king in your place. And he's going to fight against the Christ. He's going to fight against the Lord's anointed and try to keep him from having the rule. Isn't that what all of these secular rulers and the scribes and Pharisees did when Jesus came? God had appointed him to rule the world, and they're all going to try to stop him. So David is treated, he's foreshadowing the way Jesus Christ is going to be treated when he comes. That the son of David isn't treated any better than David was when he came. In verses 10 through 16, David is going to be driven out of Saul's court. We're told in 10 through 12, now it came about on the next day, so things are happening quickly, that an evil spirit from God came mightily upon Saul, and he raved in the midst of his house while David was playing the harp with his hand as usual, and a spear was in Saul's hand. And Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall. But David escaped from his presence twice. So the next day, after this song was sung, this evil spirit, this depression that God has allowed to come on Saul, falls upon him, and he begins to rage. The word literally there is prophesy, prophesy. But the dictionary says it can also be used as excited to violence, to talk wildly or incoherently, to rave. And that's the way the New American Standard translates it there. That he was just overcome with this mental disorder to the point he was just raving. And David is playing the harp, trying to soothe him and remove this evil spirit from him. And Saul has in his mind he's going to kill David right there on the spot while he's having this fit and just pin him to the wall. Yes. Yeah, it does sound like that. So maybe I know it's kind of. It sounds like maybe he did go back and forth, and watch the sheep. But that's what he was doing before. So again, maybe he did know who he was and not who his father was, or when it says he killed the Philistine, some people think it says singular there, so you think Goliath. But maybe it's using Philistine singular for the plural, the nation of the Philistine. Maybe this is later on. So he's been there for a while playing, and then the next day after that. So there's several things in the text that are troubling to try to figure out exactly the order of things as you're reading along. But we know David's going to escape from him twice. He tries to kill him with a spear. And he escapes. He's turned about, so he turned to dodge that spear. It must have been pretty short range. He's sitting there playing the harp in front of him. He's able, with agility and with God's help, he is able to avoid that spear. On two different occasions. And so it makes Saul, of course, very afraid of David, because it's another sign that the Lord who has departed from him is with David. Saul was afraid of David, for the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. So now that he's got this, you think God is with him, I should just quit fighting him, right? I mean, that would be the logical thing to do. Yeah. No, he just suspects that he doesn't have proof, but every sign points to this guy is the one God has raised up. And how could I miss? I mean, he's right there, and I threw stuck it in the wall, and I missed. How could that be? Only with God's help could he have gotten away from it. And he's afraid of him. So now he decides maybe it's better to remove him away from his presence, and perhaps he'll get killed some way. It says, now Saul was afraid of David, for the Lord was with him, but he had departed from Saul. Therefore Saul removed him from his presence and appointed him as his commander of 1,000, and he went out and came in before the people. David was prospering in all his ways, for the Lord was with him. And when Saul saw that he was prospering greatly, he dreaded him. But all Israel and Judah loved David, and he went out and came in before them. So here, so he sent away. He's made a commander of 1,000. Now he's in the view of the people. He's not just in court and is doing these great things with God's help. He seems to be a standing army now. Things have progressed in the government of Saul, where he has a large number of troops that David can be placed over, and he is prospering. Again, that same word with valor and courage, faith, intelligence. He's adept at warfare and always gains success, just like God was with Joseph in the land of Egypt and blessed everything that he put his hand to. Whether he was working for Potiphar or working in the prison house, everything prospered in his hands. Same thing with David. When God is with you and his face is on your side, none can stand against you. And he has this providential help. Again, it's not something you can explain or that you can see with, it all seems to be working just according to natural law. There's not any supernatural things going on that you can see with the eye, but yet God controls natural laws. So when we pray for things, that's what we're hoping that God will do, and we're asking God to work through natural means to answer our prayer, through his providence. And that's what was happening in David's life. And all of Israel and Judah, of course, those two parts are going to become David's kingdom someday. First Judah, and over all Israel. And they are in love with David. They think he's great. He goes in and out, carrying out these military enterprises in their presence, and they're all very impressed with him. So then Saul comes up with a new plan. Being out there, going in and out on military expeditions doesn't get him killed, but maybe if he can find some way through the marriage to his daughter that he might be able to tempt David into a trap. So starting in verse 17, it says, Then Saul said to David, Here is my older daughter, Merab. I will give her to you as wife. Only be a valiant man for me and fight the Lord's battles. For Saul thought, My hand shall not be against him, but let the hand of the Philistine be against him. But David said to Saul, Who am I? And what is my life or my father's family in Israel that I should be the king's son-in-law? So it came about at the time when Merab, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, that she was given to Adriel, the Maholathite, for a wife. So you can't tempt David to take this older daughter. David considers himself too humble in Israel. He can't offer any kind of dowry for her. He's the 8th son in the family. He's not got big prospects of inheritance. And he's just a soldier right now. And so he doesn't think it's right for him to marry the king's daughter. And so on the day that she should have been given to him, this Adriel is going to be her husband. And some people think maybe Saul was kind of insulting him by giving her away on that very day to this other man. But I don't know. That certainly. So then he finds out about a younger daughter is in love with David. So he's got a second chance to maybe get David to go out and do risky things and have the Philistines kill him. So starting in verse 17, or verse 20, it says, Now Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David. And when they told Saul, the thing was agreeable to him. And Saul thought, I will give her to him, that she may become a snare to him, and that the hand of the Philistine may be against him. Therefore Saul said to David, For a second time you may be my son-in-law today. And then Saul commanded his servants, Speak to David secretly, saying, Behold, the king delights in you, and all his servants love you. Now therefore become the king's son-in-law. So Saul's servants spoke these words to David. But David said, Is it trivial in your sight to become the king's son-in-law? since I am a poor man and lightly esteemed? And Saul's servants reported to him according to these words which David spoke. So he does everything to try to persuade David through flattery and through these secret messengers that are sent to him to certainly become his son-in-law. And he tries to find out, well, what's the reason that he's refusing so we can get around that? And he says he's poor and lightly esteemed. Well, I'll come up with some other way then for him to pay the dowry that'll put his life at risk. So in 25 it says, Saul then said, thus you shall say to David, the king does not desire any dowry except 100 foreskins of the Philistines to take vengeance on the king's enemies. So to get their foreskins, you're going to have to kill them. Take that body part and bring it back to the king as evidence that you've killed them. But to go out and kill 100 Philistines, you think surely that kind of risky maneuver, he's going to end up getting killed. But we find that David does even more than is asked. And when his servants told David these words, it pleased David to become the king's son-in-law. Before the days had expired, David rose up and went, he and his men, and struck down 200 men among the Philistines. And then David brought their foreskins, and they gave them in full number to the king, that he might become the king's son-in-law. So Saul gave him Michal, his daughter, for a wife. And when Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him, then Saul was even more afraid of David. Thus Saul was David's enemy continually. So all of this completely backfires again. You're fighting against the will of God. It's obviously going to backfire. If we go contrary to God's will, it's definitely going to turn out bad. Anybody that opposes God's will, in the end, it's going to turn out bad for them. It's not going to work because you cannot resist God's will. He is almighty, and his purpose is going to be fulfilled. And it does no good to fight against God. You're surely going to come out on the short end. But Saul is stubborn. He's abandoned God, and he is fighting against God now, just for earthly reasons. And so he doesn't. He just is like, he's really like Judas. When Judas turns against the Lord and he won't repent, he ends up committing suicide. Saul's going to end up the same way. There's no repentance. He's turned his back on God. So Michal is given to him, and she loves him. I mean, you see the list of things there to make you think this man, especially everything Saul does, ends up making David more and more like the future king, right? I mean, now he's married. Now he's married in the kingly family. So I mean, that even makes him more likely to be the king. He's the best general that he's got. That makes it more likely he would be the next king. And the daughter loves him, and the Lord loves him. So he's continually the enemy of David. That makes him the enemy of God, because he is God's anointed, the man after God's own heart. And the New Testament is filled with the same thing, and that people set themselves against the Lord. What was Saul told on the road to Damascus? Why are you persecuting me? You persecute the Lord's people, you persecute the Lord. So really, he's the enemy of God. So David even behaves more wisely in this position that he has. Then the commander of the Philistines went out to battle. And it happened as often as they went out that David behaved himself more wisely than all the servants of Saul, so his name was highly esteemed. David is one of those great military commanders in the history of the world. And he basically never loses, does he? So I'm trying to think, was there ever a battle that he lost his whole life? I can't think of one. His kingdom just grows and grows and grows until he gives it over to Solomon. Solomon takes over. It's from the river Euphrates all the way to the river of Egypt that David's in charge of. So he's like young Napoleon or Alexander the Great. God is with him, and he wins all of these battles. And every time the Philistines come out with a big army, he defeats them. And Saul is witness to all of these things. His name is highly esteemed. So then we're coming up to where we're going to have the final flight of David from Saul's court. in chapter 19. Saul hates him. He wants his servants to kill David, get him out of the way, because all he's looking at is he's a threat to my throne, my son's throne. We got to get rid of this David, this upstart, because he's surely going to take his place. 19:1 says, Now Saul told Jonathan, his son, and all his servants to put David to death. But Jonathan, Saul's son, greatly delighted in David. So Jonathan told David, saying, Saul, my father, is seeking to put you to death. Now, therefore, please be on guard in the morning, and stay in a secret place and hide yourself. And I will go out and stand beside my father in the field where you are, and I will speak with my father about you. And if I find out anything, then I will tell you. And then Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul his father, and said to him, Do not let the king sin against his servant David, since he has not sinned against you, and since his deeds have been very beneficial to you. But he took his life in his hand and struck the Philistine, and the Lord brought about a great deliverance for all Israel. You saw it and rejoiced. Why then will you sin against innocent blood by putting David to death without a cause? Saul listened to the voice of Jonathan, and Saul vowed, As the Lord lives, he shall not be put to death. And then Jonathan called David, and Jonathan told him all these words. And Jonathan brought David to Saul, and he was in his presence as formerly. So, if jealousy and madness is there, he is going to have David just murdered. No good reason. Just like Jesus was nailed to the cross and he committed no sin. Everybody at the trial said he was innocent. Pilate said it. Judas said it. Herod couldn't find anything against him. So they put him to death anyway because they didn't want him to rule. Same way here. He tells David to hide, and he meets his father in the same field that David is hiding in. So sort of like he wants David to overhear the conversation and see how he is speaking up for him, and points out all of the good things that David has done. He's done good and not evil. He risked his life for Saul and for the kingdom, and gave a great deliverance when he killed Goliath. And why would you want to shed innocent blood? And this time, Saul listens. There's going to be several more times that he says, I'm not going to kill David. But then he always goes back on it. He always changes his mind. And begins to chase him again. But they're reconciled here for the moment, but it doesn't last very long. Until the evil spirit stirs him up again to do violence. Well, next time we'll come back and look at David fleeing from Saul and things that David goes through in the wilderness.
Announcement I know of is Brad on their way. Her dad's having problems, homes or something. So they're in a rush to get there. And Foster and Bill and Teresa are all heading that way too to see how he's doing. I don't know if is there anything special that I missed, know about. No, the invitation is this song is Lord. In my studies, I like to go back to Kings and the Chronicles to see what goes on, and it was in Second Kings 20. It talks about the age of King Josiah, the story we know about, in the temple, and as they people that were repairing it, they found Paul in 22 and 8, and they started reading. Then in verse 10, they for the king, and the king, we know, was upset. He ran his clothes. He was, whether it was because they didn't have the law or they just found it, where had this thing been, or that we've been doing something wrong. And I got to think, that would be something today if our would read the Bible and figured out we're doing something wrong. Of course, I got to think, well, what would in the world would happen if he brings the Bible on national, tells everybody this is what we need to do? There would be an uproar like you wouldn't believe. but would it start something great? So King Josiah starts to clean house. That's about the only way I can figure it out. And when you go back to 1 Kings 13, it's prophesied by name that King Josiah would do what he's going to do. And there was a prophet we know that went to, I can't remember the name of it, but when he went to prophesy to tell him what's going to happen, you know, he was told to go one way. Go there, do not eat, drink, do not stay. And he left to go another way home. And an old prophet came. Well, we know that story that he was killed. The old prophet came out, took his bones, he buried him, told his family, when I die, you bury my bones next to the young prophet that didn't do what God told him. And that's told in 23, 2 Kings 23 and 16 and 17, when Josiah looks over at the tombs and they bring the bones out, which was prophesied by the young prophet, and burned them on the altar to defile it from all the things that were in the temple, the figures, the incense burning, everything. He just tore all that up and brought it out because it was against God. And in 16 it says, and as Josiah turned himself, he spied the sepulchres that were there in the mount, and sent and took the bones out of the sepulchre and burned them on the altar and polluted it according to the word of the Lord, which the man of God proclaimed, who proclaimed these words. And he said, what title is that I see? And the men of the city told him, it's a sepulchre of the men of God, which came from Judah, and proclaimed these things that thou hast done against the author of Bethel. And I got thinking then, well, if it's the president that brings it out, maybe I ought to bring it a little closer in the home. And me, as I read, you know, that in 2 Timothy, you know, study to show yourself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not be ashamed, rightly dividing the truth. And I think as I read, do I see my life being in line with Scripture? Am I living? Am I saying? Am I doing? Am I acting? Am I thinking? The Bible tells us all we need for life. It tells us how to think, how to act, how to walk, how to talk, how to live. Everything we need to know is in there. And I thought that brought it more closer to home, that maybe my life doesn't fit Scripture. Maybe some of the things, you know, as Josiah found out, we're doing something wrong. And you have to really examine yourself very much to see, how am I walking? How am I acting? Because we tell people baptism is essential. How many in just Oklahoma don't believe that baptism is essential for salvation? There's so many things. If we can just look at ourselves, we have that. You know, I guess this Bible is really our special mirror that we can look in. But we really have to adjust ourselves to be able to see, how am I living? Am I an example? Self-examination is probably the hardest for us to do. I know I used to work at the Daily Oklahoman at night, what they called the mail room, where you get the papers ready. And I had messed up getting wrong ads in the wrong papers, and they go to the wrong area of town. And this woman was the boss, and she said, I don't even have to chew on you. She says, you're so hard on yourself that you've done it already. You know what you did. And my kids think I'm probably the hardest thing in the world too. But I'm harder on myself than I am anybody else that I've ever been around. Because I press for perfection, but it's not ever going to be there. You'll never make it. There was only one that was. Examine ourselves to see how we live. We'll stand and sing 312.
The voice of the Savior.